The candles in the Marlowe ballroom had been burning for 3 hours, and the air was thick with the smell of hot wax and lemon polish, and the sharp green smell of the orange trees in their pots along the wall. The floor shook a little under the country dance. The music was too fast. It always was at the Marlowe balls, because Lady Marlowe liked her guests tired and red in the face, and too breathless to gossip, though they always found the breath for it anyway. Maren Ellery stood where she always stood on these evenings, beside the third pillar from the door, where the candlelight fell soft and kind, and nobody had to look at her twice. She had her gloves on, her good kid gloves gone soft and pale at the fingers, and under the cover of her folded hands she was doing the thing she always did. She was counting the candles. There were 140 candles in the Marlowe ballroom. She knew this because she had counted them at every ball for 7 years. 40 in the 2 great chandeliers overhead, dripping wax onto little glass cups. 60 in the brackets on the walls, where the flames bowed every time the doors opened and let the night air in. 40 more in the tall standing lamps by the doors and the card room, behind glass chimneys smoked dark at the top. A mind that is busy counting candles is a mind that cannot be hurt. And Maren had learnt this young, the way some girls learn the steps of a dance. She was 24 years old. She was not ugly. She wanted that understood, though there was no one in the room to understand it. Her face was simply a quiet face. Her hair was brown. Her eyes were grey. Her mouth was a little too serious, and nothing about her made a man turn his head. She was the niece of Baron Pell, which meant she had a place in rooms like this one, and no real place at all. Her father had been the Baron's younger brother, a soldier, dead at Badajoz when she was 9. Her mother had followed him into the ground 2 winters later, worn out by grief, and a cough that would not stop. Maren had been taken into her uncle's house the way a spare chair is taken into a room. It was useful to have. Nobody chose it. Her Aunt Livia had explained her position to her once, kindly, the way you explain the weather. Maren had been 17, standing in front of a glass in her first ball dress, which was really her cousin Sabina's second-best dress cut down. She had dared to hope a little. Her aunt had watched her turn in front of the mirror, and had said, in a voice as soft as fur, "Do not hope too much, child. You are too plain to be chosen. Some girls are born to stand at the wall, and you are one of them, and the sooner you stop hoping, the kinder life will be to you." Maren had cried that night, alone, with the door locked. She had never cried about it again. Hope, she found, was like a candle. If you kept lighting it and the world kept blowing it out, the sensible thing was to stop lighting it. So she had stopped. She had become very good at standing still. She had become very good at watching. She had a whole life inside her that no one suspected, rich as a locked room full of books, because it was a locked room full of books. She had read her uncle's library from one end to the other, and she could remember whole pages the way other people remembered songs. Tonight the room was more crowded than usual, and the air was hotter, and the gossip had a high, bright sound, like glasses tapped with a knife. Maren did not have to ask why. She had heard it in the carriage on the way over, because her aunt and Sabina had talked across her as if she were the upholstery. The Duke of Rathmore was back in London. The Duke of Rathmore, who had not attended a ball in 4 years, who had buried his father and his brother and come into the title, and a fortune beyond counting, who was 31 years old and unmarried and the single greatest prize on the marriage market, had sent word that he might put in an appearance at Lady Marlowe's ball. Every mamma in the room had heard it. Every daughter had been dressed for it. Sabina Pell had been dressed for it in rose silk with pearls at her throat, and she stood now in the row of pretty girls near the floor, arranged like flowers at a market stall, and her fan moved fast, and her laugh came a little too loud, and Maren watched her with the calm of a person watching weather from inside a house. The candles in the far wall brackets bowed as the doors opened again. The heat pressed against Maren's skin. Somewhere behind her a woman laughed too hard at nothing, and the sound of it grated like a spoon in a glass. Maren folded her hands a little tighter and began, from the chandeliers, to count again. 40 in the chandeliers, 60 on the walls. She had done this for 7 years. She expected to do it for 7 more, and 7 after that, until she was old, and then until she was done. It did not occur to her that anything would ever interrupt the counting. That is the thing about the night your life changes. It smells, at first, exactly like every other night, of wax and lemon polish, and other people's perfume, and the faint sour smell of wine on other people's breath. He came in at 10:30, without announcement, the way weather comes in. Maren felt it before she saw it. The footmen by the doors straightened all at once, the way they never did for anyone else, not from fear exactly, but from old habit, the habit of a house where one man's word was law. The sound of the room changed. It did not stop. It dropped, the way a fire drops when a door is opened, and then it rose again twice as loud, because everyone was talking about the one thing they were all pretending not to look at. Maren looked. She looked the way she looked at everything, from behind her pillar, quietly, with her hands folded over her gloves. The Duke of Rathmore was not handsome. She had expected handsome, because Sabina had talked about him for a fortnight, as if he were a painting. He was not a painting. He was a large man, tall and broad through the shoulders, and he took up space without seeming to try, the way a fire takes up a room. His face was heavy-boned and still, his jaw dark with a day's beard. His eyes set deep under a straight black brow. His hair was black and too long, as if he had better things to do than visit a barber. He wore black, plain and perfect, no jewels, no fobs, nothing that glittered. And his boots, Maren noticed because she noticed everything, his boots were not dancing pumps but riding boots, cleaned to within an inch of their lives but still riding boots. As if he had come from a long way off and did not care who knew it. He looked like a man who had walked into the wrong room and did not mind. He looked, she thought, like a man who had never once in his life counted candles, because no room he stood in had ever failed to arrange itself around him. Lady Marlowe bore down on him with her plumes nodding, and he bent his head to her and said whatever politeness required, but his eyes were already moving over the room. They moved slowly. They were not the eyes of a man looking for amusement. They were the eyes of a man taking stock, of a field, of a horse, of a room full of people he did not trust. They passed over the row of pretty girls. Sabina dropped into a curtsy so deep it was nearly a collapse, and the Duke's gaze moved over her the way it moved over the wallpaper, and kept moving. It moved down the line of daughters, the store girl, the Ellingham twins, Lady Caroline Ashe with her famous neck. It did not stop on any of them. It came across the floor, over the heads of the dancers, and it stopped on the 3rd pillar from the door. It stopped on Maren. She knew it at once, with the deep animal knowledge of a person who has spent 7 years watching rooms and knows exactly how eyes behave. His gaze touched her and did not move on. She did not drop into a curtsy. She did not flutter her fan. She did not have a fan. She did the thing she always did when the world pressed on her. She dropped her eyes to her glove, where a thread had worked loose at the seam of the thumb, and she began very carefully to wind the thread back around her finger, smoothing it flat, making the small thing right. It was her armor. It had always been her armor. When the world looked at her, she found a small task and she did it well, and the looking slid off her like rain off oiled cloth. Only tonight it did not slide off. She could feel the weight of his gaze the way you feel the heat of a fire on one side of your face. She wound the thread. She smoothed it. She counted to 20 in her head. When she looked up again, he was still watching her. He was standing in the middle of a room that was performing for him, with all its might, the laughing, the fluttering, the mammas edging their daughters forward like chess pieces, and he was watching a woman in a cut-down dress wind a thread around her finger beside a pillar. He watched her for too long. He watched her for so long that other people began to notice him doing it. She saw heads turn. She saw Lady Marlowe follow his gaze and frown, as if the room had a smudge on it she could not place. Maren's heart had begun to beat in a slow, hard way she did not recognize. She told it to stop. It did not stop. The first dance of the late set was forming. The musicians lifted their bows, and the Duke of Rathmore began to walk. He did not walk around the edge of the room, the way a careful man walks. He walked through it. Later, Maren would piece together what the room did in those moments, from the things people said to her face and behind her back. But while it was happening, she saw only pieces of it, the way you see pieces of a storm. She saw the dancers falter. Not all at once. It moved through them like wind through a field of wheat. First the couples nearest the doors saw him coming, and their steps went ragged, and then the couples behind them felt something wrong, and turned their heads, and the turning spread, couple by couple, down the whole length of the floor. The music kept playing for 3 bars, 4. And then the violinist saw what the dancers were seeing, and the music stumbled and caught and stumbled again and died. The last note hung in the hot air and faded. The room went quiet. It was not a small quiet. It was the quiet of 200 people holding one breath. The candles hissed in their brackets. Somewhere a woman's fan stopped moving, and the silence where its small wind had been seemed enormous. The Duke of Rathmore walked down the center of the floor through the parted dancers, and his riding boots made a slow, even sound on the boards, and nobody spoke, and nobody moved. Sabina Pell stood directly in his path. Rose silk, pearls, her fan half raised, her mouth already shaping a smile 2 weeks in the making. She sank into her curtsy as he came level with her. She stayed down in it, glowing, waiting. The Duke walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture. Maren heard the small sound Sabina made, no louder than a mouse in a wall, and she would have pitied her if she had had any pity to spare from the sheer fact of what was happening. He came past the Ellingham twins. He came past Lady Caroline Ashe, who actually put out her hand. Maren saw it, a white hand rising like a flag, and the Duke did not even turn his head. He walked the whole length of that room with every eye in London on his back, and he stopped in front of the 3rd pillar from the door, in front of a woman in a cut-down dress with a loose thread wound around her finger, and the quiet in the room changed quality. It went from shock to hunger. Maren would hear that hunger fed for months afterward. Every person there would tell the story for the rest of their lives, and every telling would begin the same way. I was there. I was standing not 10 feet away. I saw the whole thing. Miss Ellery. He said her name as if he had always known it. Not a question. Not a guess. Her name, in his mouth, as familiar as the name of a place he had lived. She looked up at him. Up close he was larger than he had looked from across the room, and he smelled of cold night air and horse and clean wool, and under that something like wood smoke, as if he carried the weather in on his coat. His eyes, up close, were not black, but a dark, deep brown. And they were doing the strangest thing. They were waiting. "You are standing at the wrong pillar, Your Grace," Maren said. Her voice came out quiet and even, which surprised her because nothing else in her was quiet or even. "The pretty ones are on the other side of the room." A muscle moved in his jaw. She could not tell if it was anger or its opposite. "I am standing," he said, "exactly where I meant to stand." "Then someone has misdirected you," she said. "It happens constantly. I am the person people speak to while they are looking for someone else. Did you lose a wager?" It was out before she could stop it. 7 years of silence had taught her tongue nothing, but 7 years of books had taught it plenty, and it had chosen this moment to wake up. She heard someone gasp, a bright, delighted, terrible gasp, And she thought, well, that is the end of me. Nobody spoke to the Duke of Rathmore that way. She waited for the coldness to come down over his face like a shutter. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, nothing so public as a smile, but the small private shift that comes before one. I do not make wagers, he said. I make decisions. The first dance of the late set is beginning. I have not asked for any hand tonight. I am asking for yours. He held out his hand. Time did something strange then. It stretched. Maren would remember the next few seconds for the rest of her life, with a clearness that other memories never had. The heat of the room on her skin, the tick of wax dripping in the chandelier above, the smell of the orange trees going sharp and sweet, the 200 held breaths, and his hand, held out, palm up, bare, big and scarred across the knuckles, waiting, not grabbing, not commanding. Waiting, she understood, with the whole of her watching, counting, careful mind, that this was the moment the rest of her life would be measured from. She could refuse him, and go back to her pillar, and count candles for the rest of her days and be safe. Or she could put her hand in his and never be safe again. She unwound the thread from her finger. She put her hand in his. His hand closed around hers, warm through the worn kid of her glove, and he led her out onto the floor, and the room stayed silent. It stayed silent through the whole first figure of the dance. 200 people watching a duke dance the first dance with the plain girl from beside the pillar. He danced the way he did everything she would learn, without a single wasted movement, as if dancing were a job to be done properly. He did not make conversation. He held her hand at the turns and let it go at exactly the right moment, and took it again, and once, when the figure brought them close, he said low, "For her alone you did not answer my question." "You did not ask one," she said. "You announced." "I did," he agreed. "It is a fault. My brother used to say I would announce my own funeral." The figure carried them apart before she could answer, and when it brought them together again, she said, "And what have you decided, Your Grace, since you are so decided?" He looked at her over the joined hands, and for the first time something moved behind the stillness of his face. Something quick and alive. "That this is the first interesting evening I have had in 4 years, he said. "That is not an answer," she said. "No," he said. "It is the beginning of one." The dance ended. He bowed over her hand. The room, which had held its breath for the length of a country dance, let it out all at once in a roar of whispers that sounded like the sea coming in. Maren walked back to her pillar on legs she did not trust. Her Aunt Livia was already moving across the room toward her, with her eyes shining and her fan going like a signal flag, and Sabina was white to the lips, and Lady Marlowe was staring, and Maren stood by her pillar and folded her hands over her gloves, and her heart beat slow and hard, and the candles burned, 140 of them, and for the first time in 7 years she could not have said how many there were. She had not counted. She had forgotten to count. The carriage ride home was the longest of Maren's life. Her aunt talked the whole way, not to her but at her, the way people talk at a fire they are trying to poke into flame. The Duke of Rathmore. The first dance. Her hand. "Do you understand what this means, Maren? Do you understand what you must do now? You must smile more. You must never say things like that again. Did you truly ask him if he had lost a wager? Sabina heard you. Half the room heard you. You could have ruined everything." And Sabina sat in the corner of the carriage in her rose silk and said nothing at all, and looked at Maren the way you look at a servant who has been given your room. The carriage smelled of Sabina's rose water, and the wet wool of the coachman's cloak coming through the window, and the wheels went round and round on the wet stones, and Maren sat with her hands folded and said, "Yes, aunt, and no, aunt," at the right places, and thought about a hand held out, palm up, waiting. She did not believe in it. That is the honest thing, and she was an honest woman. at least with herself. Dukes did not cross rooms for girls like her. Men like that were moved by things she could not see: debts, alliances, whims, wages, whatever it was she had accused him of. She lay awake that night in her small room at the top of her uncle's house, listening to the rain start against the window, and she turned it over and over, the way you turn a stone, looking for the crack that shows what it really is. She could not find it. That frightened her more than the other thing would have. He called 2 days later. Her aunt nearly fainted when the card came up. The actual card, Rathmore, in black ink, nothing else. He sat in the drawing room for the correct 20 minutes, and drank a cup of tea and spoke to Baron Pell about the harvest in Norfolk, and to Maren he said almost nothing at all. But when he rose to leave, he paused by her chair and said, in the same low voice he had used in the dance, "You were right about the pillar. The view is better from this side of the room." And then he was gone, and her aunt had to sit down. He came again at the end of the week, and found her in the square garden across from the house, where she walked every morning before the fashionable world was awake, because it was the 1 hour of the day that belonged to her. He was walking too, or he said he was. She suspected, and later knew, that he had asked the servants when she walked. He fell into step beside her without asking, and they went around the square in the cold morning air that smelled of wet earth and coal smoke, and he said, "Tell me what you are thinking." "I was thinking," she said, "that you are going to a great deal of trouble, and I do not know why, and I do not like not knowing why." Most women, he said, would have found a compliment in there somewhere. Most women, she said, have not spent 7 years learning what compliments are worth. He was quiet for half the square. Then he said, "No, I expect they haven't." He did not offer her a compliment. She noticed that. She noticed everything he did not do. The third meeting was in Hatchard's bookshop, and it was the one she would remember. She went every fortnight to choose the books her uncle grudgingly allowed on his account. Novels for Sabina, a history for her uncle to be seen reading, and for herself, whatever she could find that she had not read, which by then was a hard search. She was standing on the small ladder in the back of the shop, reaching for a volume of travels, when a voice below her said, "Not that one. He is a liar, and a dull one. The volume beside it is better." The woman who wrote it actually went to the places she describes. She looked down, and there he was, the Duke of Rathmore, in a brown coat, with rain in his black hair, holding 4 books under one arm and looking up at her as if dukes spent every Tuesday morning in the back of bookshops. "You read travel books," she said. It came out flat with surprise. "I read everything," he said. "It is the one vice I have kept." He reached up, took down the volume he had recommended, and held it out to her, and she came down the ladder and took it. And the shop smelled of dust and paper and the leather of old bindings, and outside the rain ticked against the windows. And they stood between the shelves and argued about books for nearly an hour. He was wrong about half of them, and she told him so, and he did not seem to mind being told. At one point he said, "You do not talk to me the way people talk to me." And she said, "People talk to you the way they talk to the weather. It cannot be answered, so they make conversation at it. You are a man. I talk to you as a man." He was quiet at that, and he looked at her in that heavy waiting way he had, and then he said, very simply, "Thank you," as if she had given him something, and Maren, who had not been thanked by anyone above the rank of housemaid in years, had to look away and study the spine of a book about Egypt until her face behaved. She bought the book he had recommended. It was as good as he had said. She read it twice, and she hated how much that mattered to her. At home, the change was stranger than in the ballrooms. Her Aunt Livia had discovered overnight that Maren had always been her favourite, and she said so, in front of visitors with her hand pressed to her heart. Sabina did not discover anything. Sabina went about the house with her mouth pinched small, like a drawstring bag pulled tight, and she found small ways to be cruel that could never be proved. A teacup set down too close to Maren's sleeve, a compliment that had a fishhook in it. "How clever you are, Maren, to have made yourself mysterious. I could never have thought of it. I should not know how to be that quiet on purpose." Maren let it all pass over her. She had spent 7 years learning that silence is not the same as defeat. But at night, alone, she admitted the truth to herself, because she had promised herself long ago that she would always have one person in the world she never lied to. She liked him. She liked his heavy, waiting silences. She liked that he was wrong about books and did not mind being told. She liked the way he looked at a room as if he were responsible for it. And liking him was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, because hope, as she knew better than anyone, was a candle, and she had felt herself reaching for the flame. Lady Odella Vane gave a musical evening in the second week of May, and everyone who was anyone was there, which meant that Maren was there too, because for 2 weeks she had been interesting. That is what the Duke's attention did. It did not make her less plain. It made her a puzzle, and society loved a puzzle the way a dog loves a bone, to worry it to pieces. People spoke to her now. Ladies who had walked past her for 7 years now took her arm and called her dear, and asked her, smiling, how long she had known His Grace. What they talked about, what he was like, and their eyes went over her face like hands over a piece of goods, looking for the thing that must be there, the trick, the secret, and not finding it. The evening had been pleasant enough until then. In the thin way such evenings were pleasant. A girl with a pretty voice had sung 3 Italian songs nobody understood, and a young man with a high collar had played the pianoforte with great feeling and very little accuracy, and everyone had applauded in the right places. Maren had sat in her usual corner beside her aunt, and she had noticed, because noticing was her whole education, that the courtesy shown to her now had a different texture than kindness. Kindness is warm. This was cool and smooth and watchful like marble. She was being measured. Every lady in that room had a daughter or a niece or a friend who had wanted the Duke of Rathmore, and Maren was the explanation none of them could find. And there is nothing society hates so much as an answer it cannot understand. She felt it in the way their smiles stopped at their lips. She felt it in the way conversations paused when she came near, and resumed a note higher when she passed. She kept her hands folded and her face calm, and under the cover of the music she counted, out of old habit, not candles this time but the gas lamps on the wall, and the tall windows, and the years she had left to learn to bear this new, louder kind of being seen. Lady Odella Vane was 50 years old, a widow twice over, rich as sin, and the coldest woman in London. She had ruled every drawing room she entered for 30 years, and she ruled them the way generals rule, by knowing where everyone's weak place was. She had watched the Duke of Rathmore's courtship, the whole town was calling it that now, with an eye like a hawk watching a field. And Maren had felt that eye on her all evening, the way you feel a draught. The music was over. The guests were gathered in the long drawing room, and the candles were low, and the air was close and sweet with hothouse flowers, and someone proposed charades, and Lady Odella, in a voice as smooth as cream, said, "Oh, but let us make it fair. Some of us are so practiced at sitting things out. Miss Ellery, you will not mind keeping the score, will you? You have had so much experience of not being chosen. 7 years of it, I am told." She smiled. The room smiled with her, the way rooms do, not because it was funny, but because she was Lady Odella. "It is quite a talent, really," she went on, letting her voice carry to every corner. "Some girls are not born to be chosen. They are born to make the chosen look brighter, and Miss Ellery makes the rest of us look positively dazzling. We ought to thank her. She has made a career of being overlooked." The laughter came, that soft, cruel drawing-room laughter that sounds like silk tearing. Maren felt it hit her the way cold water hits. She had been laughed at before. She had been overlooked, pitied, and dismissed. But no one had ever said it out loud in a full room before. No one had ever taken her 7 quiet years and held them up, and made them into a joke for people to wipe their feet on. Her face was hot. Her hands, in her lap, were perfectly cold. She was aware, with a strange second sight, of everyone in the room. Sabina, laughing with one hand over her mouth, her aunt, smiling desperately. Because one did not offend Lady Odella, and in the doorway, newly arrived, still in his greatcoat with the evening damp on his shoulders, the Duke of Rathmore, watching, Maren stood up. The room quieted, curious, waiting for tears or flight, the two things plain girls were supposed to produce. She gave them neither. She crossed the small space to the table where the scorecards and pencils lay beside a bowl of hothouse peaches. She picked up the pencil. She sharpened it, slowly and carefully, with the little penknife that lay beside the cards, and the room watched her do it in total silence. Then she said, in a voice that carried to every corner without ever rising, "How strange, Lady Odella, that a woman so often chosen should need a wallflower to feel it." She set the pencil down. "I will keep the score," she said. "I am very accurate. I have had a great deal of practice in paying attention to things no one else bothers to see." She sat down, picked up the cards, and looked around the room with calm, grey, unhurried eyes, and said, "Shall we begin?" No one laughed then. The silence had teeth in it now, and they were not pointed at Maren. Lady Odella's face had gone the colour of old paper, and 2 or 3 of the quicker ladies had already rearranged their faces into something that was not quite enjoyment of her discomfort, and the game began in an atmosphere of the most exquisite awkwardness anyone there had ever endured. Maren kept the score. Her hand did not shake. She had not thought it would. 7 years of counting candles is also 7 years of learning to be still while the storm goes over, and the storm went over, and she was still there when it passed. But the Duke, standing in the doorway, saw what no one else in that room thought to look for. He saw the way she held the pencil, a little too tightly, so that the knuckles of her right hand were white. He saw her press her left hand flat against her skirt, once, very hard, to stop something. He saw the cost of it, and he stood in the doorway with the damp on his shoulders and looked at the room that had laughed at her. And something in his face settled, the way a door settles when it is locked from the inside. The Duke of Rathmore went home that night, and did not go to bed. His house in Grosvenor Square was large and quiet, and his study was at the back of it, away from the street, and he sat there in his shirt-sleeves with the fire burning low, and a glass of brandy he did not drink warming in his hand, and he thought. He thought the way he always thought, in order, the way his father had taught him, as if a problem were an estate. Walk its boundaries first, then decide what to build. The facts were these. He had danced with Miss Maren Ellery in public, called at her house in public, walked with her in public, and been seen arguing with her in a bookshop by no fewer than 6 persons of quality. He had done this deliberately. He did nothing by accident. But he had not, until tonight. Fully counted the cost to her. He had thought of his attention as a gift. Tonight he had seen it used as a weapon against her. Lady Odella Vane had not been laughing at Maren. She had been laughing at him, through Maren, because Maren was the only part of him the Odella Vanes of the world could reach. He saw that clearly. He saw too what came next. His attentions would cool. Society would decide they had cooled, whether they had or not. And then the same people who had laughed tonight would laugh again, harder, with better reason. They would say the plain girl had been tried and found wanting. They would say she had reached above herself and been set back down. She would spend the rest of her life paying for 2 weeks of his curiosity. He had seen it happen to other women, other puzzles. The town solved them and threw the pieces away. He let his mind go where it did not often go, back to his brother, dead 4 years, reckless and charming and loved by everyone, the heir, the favourite, the one who was supposed to carry it all. Callum had never carried anything but his own pleasures, and when the horse came down on him at Newmarket, it had been the younger son, the spare, the quiet one nobody had looked at twice, who had come home to a broken father and an estate drowning in debt, and had put his shoulder under the whole of it, and lifted. His father had died 2 years later, mostly of grief and mostly at night, and Alistair had sat in this same study through those long evenings, listening to the old man talk about Callum, and had learned the exact weight of being the one who was left. He had learned that being chosen second was its own education. It taught you to look for the people nobody else was looking at, because you knew what it was to be one. Perhaps that was the true beginning of it, he thought, and not the pillar at all. Perhaps he had recognized her the way you recognize your own handwriting in a stranger's hand. The fire settled. He turned the brandy glass in his fingers and looked into it. He was a man who solved problems. He had run an estate of 40,000 acres since he was 27. He had brought it back from his father's debts and his brother's carelessness. He knew how to see a thing whole and decide. The problem, stated plainly, was this. He had made Maren Ellery visible, and visible was a dangerous thing to be, and there was exactly one act in his power that would make her unassailably, permanently safe. It happened also to be, and he was honest enough, alone in the small hours, to admit this to himself, though to no one else, the thing he most wanted to do. He examined the wanting, because he did not trust wanting. He had watched his brother want things, loudly and constantly, and die of it in a ditch outside Newmarket, with a horse on top of him. He asked himself the hard questions. Was it pity? No. Pity did not lean against a study mantel at 2 in the morning. Was it contrariness, the pleasure of choosing what the world had not chosen for him? He considered it fairly and set it aside. The world had offered him the Ellingham twins and Lady Caroline Ashe, and he had felt nothing at all. Was it her face? Her form? He was almost amused. She was right about herself. She was plain, in the way a grey morning is plain, in the way bread is plain, in the way all the things a man actually lives on are plain. And when she had stood up in Lady Odella's drawing-room and sharpened that pencil, slow and steady, and handed back the cruelty folded smaller than she had received it, he had felt something he had not felt in 4 years of ballrooms. He had felt proud to be in the same room, proud of a woman he had met 4 times. He set the brandy down untouched and stood up. His decision, when he examined it, turned out to have been made already, perhaps in the ballroom, perhaps in the bookshop, perhaps tonight, watching her hand press flat against her skirt to make it stop shaking. The making did not matter. The doing did. He rang for his secretary, who came in his dressing gown with his hair on end and did not blink. He had worked for Rathmore 9 years. "Be here at 8, the Duke said. "Bring the marriage settlements book. And send a note to Baron Pell. I will call on him at 11. "Yes, Your Grace," his secretary said. He was at the door when the Duke said, "Felton, Your Grace?" The boy at the Pell house. The one who dropped the tray at the at-home, the one the butler was going to turn off. "You saw to it." Felton allowed himself the ghost of a smile, as Your Grace instructed. The glasses were paid for quietly, and the boy was told his place is safe, and no one was told where the money came from. "Good," the Duke said, and turned back to the fire, and that was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. He never mentioned it again. But servants talk, and kitchens have ears, and it was not 3 days before Nan the housemaid told the cook, and the cook told Betsy the parlour-maid, and Betsy told Maren's maid, and Maren's maid, a romantic girl, told Maren, in a rush, while brushing her hair. How the Duke himself had been in the passage when the tray went down, how he had picked up the pieces alongside the boy, how he had said, "A boy who is dropped for dropping things will learn only to hide them," and how he had paid for the lot and sworn everyone to silence. Maren sat very still in front of her mirror. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you ought to know what he is, miss," the girl said simply, "when nobody is looking. He called on Baron Pell at 11, and what passed in the Baron's study Maren never knew in detail, because her uncle came out of it red and dazed, and clutching the mantle like a man who has been told the house is on fire and he has won a prize for it. He sent for her. He looked at her as if he had never seen her before, which in a way he had not, and he said, 'The Duke of Rathmore has asked my permission to address you. Do you understand what I am saying to you, girl?' 'Yes, uncle,' she said. 'I am not a fool.' 'No,' he said slowly. 'I am beginning to think none of us knew what you are.' It was the nearest thing to an apology she ever got from him, and she took it for what it was worth, which was little, but not nothing. But the Duke did not come to her privately. That was the thing she did not expect, and the thing everyone else did not expect, and the thing that made it what it was. He waited for the Hartfield ball, the largest of the season, the room where half the ton would be gathered under one ceiling, and he waited until the middle of the evening, when the dancing was at its height, and the gossip with it. Lady Odella Vane was there, holding court by the fireplace, and she had not learned or would not learn, and Maren heard her say, as Maren passed with her aunt, in that carrying cream smooth voice, "The novelty will wear off. It always does. Dukes collect oddities the way boys collect beetles, and they tire of them just as quickly." Her aunt's hand tightened on her arm to hurry her past. Maren did not hurry. She never hurried any more. She had noticed something about hurrying. It was a way of agreeing that you should not be where you were. The musicians finished a set. In the small pause, the Duke of Rathmore stepped up onto the low musicians' platform at the end of the room, and the room felt him do it the way a field feels weather, and began to go quiet in the way Maren now knew. From the edges inward, silence spreading like dusk. He stood there, big and black-clad and still, and he waited until the last whisper died and the only sounds were the hiss of the candles and the creak of the floor and the rustle of 200 people turning to face him. He did not clear his throat. He did not smile, he said. In his carrying, unhurried voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask your patience for 1 minute. I have an announcement to make, and I would rather make it once to all of you than have it reach you in the usual way, growing at every telling." The silence was now absolute. Maren stood very still beside her aunt, and her heart began its slow, hard beating, because she knew. She did not know how she knew. She knew. "You are all discussing Miss Maren Ellery," the Duke said. "I have heard you doing it for 3 weeks. You have discussed her face, her family, her fortune and her chances, and you have not been kind, and you have not been quiet, and some of you have been cruel in rooms where you thought no one who mattered was listening." His eyes moved slowly over the crowd, and more than one lady found something suddenly fascinating in her fan. "Let me save you the trouble of further discussion. Here are the facts." He turned then and looked directly at Maren, across the whole length of that crowded, silent room, and he said, "Miss Ellery, I asked your uncle's permission this morning, and he gave it. Now I ask you, in front of everyone, so that no one in this room can ever again pretend not to know where I stand. I am asking for your hand in marriage. Take as long as you need to answer. I am not going anywhere." The room did not gasp. It did something stranger. It made no sound at all, a silence so complete that Maren could hear the wax dripping in the chandeliers, and the rain beginning against the high windows, and her own heart, slow and hard and steady now, not frightened at all. Lady Odella Vane stood by the fireplace with her mouth slightly open, and for the first time in 30 years of drawing rooms, no one was looking at her. Everyone was looking at Maren, and Maren looked back at the Duke of Rathmore across the sea of turned faces. And she did the thing that no one, perhaps not even he, expected. She did not answer. She looked at him for a long, clear moment, And then she gave him a single small deliberate nod. Not submission, not surrender, but acknowledgement. And the room understood that whatever was between these two people, it would be settled between these two people, and nowhere else. And the Duke bowed to her, deep and formal, as if she were a queen and he her subject, and stepped down off the platform, and the musicians, at a signal, began to play, and the ball lurched back to life around a silence-shaped hole that would be talked about for 20 years. The crowd did what crowds do with a moment too large for them. It broke into pieces. Some turned at once to their neighbors and began the work of turning history into gossip, and by midnight the story had already grown ornaments it did not need. Some stood where they were and simply looked at Maren, and she saw, in more than one face, the labor of adjustment, the mind moving furniture around to make room for a fact it had not planned for. Lady Odella Vane closed her mouth and opened it, and closed it again, and for the first time in living memory found nothing to say, and the space around her at the fireplace grew, slowly and unmistakably, the way a circle grows around something broken. No one chose to be seen standing beside the woman who had wagered her authority on the Duke's indifference, and lost. Sabina stood near the musicians with her rose silk and her pearls, and her perfect posture, and she watched Maren across the room with an expression that was not envy quite, but the thing just behind envy. The bewilderment of a person who has followed every rule of the game and watched it won by someone who did not seem to know the rules existed. The musicians played. The dancers formed again, a little ragged, because no one's heart was in it. The candles hissed, and Maren stood beside her aunt, who was weeping quite openly now into a lace handkerchief, and felt, for the first time in that long strange spring, not like a woman at the edge of a room but like the still center of it. He found her an hour later in the Hartfields' library, where she had gone, as she always went, to the edges of things. The house party was loud down the hall, but the library was dark and cool and smelled of dust and leather, and the lavender that had been laid between the pages of the books to keep the moths away. Rain ran down the windows. He closed the door behind him, and the noise of the ball dropped to a far-off murmur, like the sea heard from inside a house. She was standing by the shelves with one candle in her hand, and she turned as he came in, and they looked at each other across the quiet room. "You said I could take as long as I needed," she said. "I meant it," he said. "I did not come in here for your answer. I came because you left the room and I wanted to know that you were all right." "I am all right," she said. She set the candle down on the table between them, and the flame bent in the air of his moving and then stood still. "But I want to know why. I have wanted to know why since the first night, and I am done pretending I do not care about the answer. You are the Duke of Rathmore. You could have any woman in England. The Ellingham twins are beautiful. Lady Caroline Ashe is beautiful, and her father owns half of Derbyshire. And you crossed a ballroom for a woman who was winding a thread around her finger beside a pillar. So tell me why. Not the pretty answer, the true one." He was quiet for a moment. He came a step closer, and she saw that his hands were not as steady as his voice, and that steadied her, strangely, more than anything else could have. "The true one, then," he said. "It is not pretty. I came to that ball because my secretary told me I had to be seen, because 4 years of absence had made me a story people told, and I preferred to tell it myself. I did not intend to stay an hour. I stood in that room and I looked at 200 people performing, and I knew every step of every performance, because I have watched them since I was a boy. And then I looked at the pillar, and there you were, and you were not performing. You were doing something small, and doing it properly, and you did not look up. Do you know how rare that is, Miss Ellery, a person who does not look up? I have been looked up at all my life. I have been calculated at, and angled at, and smiled at from a distance with the angle of the smile worked out in advance. You were the only person in that room who was not selling anything. He paused. I wanted to know what a person like that thinks about. That is all it was. At first. That is the honest beginning of it. And after, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, folded at her waist, were not quite. You cannot build a marriage on curiosity, Your Grace. No, he said. So I will tell you the rest. I watched you for 3 weeks. I watched you refuse to perform for me, in your uncle's drawing room, and in the square, and in the bookshop, and I have never been refused anything in my life, and I found I liked it better than all the agreeing I have ever had. I watched you in Lady Odella's drawing room, when she said the cruelest thing I have ever heard said in a room full of people, and you stood up and handed it back to her folded in half, and your hand did not shake, except it did, Miss Ellery. I saw you press it against your skirt to make it stop. I saw what it cost you, and I thought. He stopped. For the first time, the steady voice was not steady, and he looked away from her, at the rain on the dark window, and she watched him gather the thing he had not meant to say, and say it anyway. I thought, I have spent 4 years being a story people tell. She has spent 7 years being invisible, and I would rather stand beside her pillar than anywhere else in England. The rain ticked on the glass. The candle burned between them, and its small heat touched her face. He went on, quieter now. You asked for the truth, so here is all of it. There are 140 candles in the Marlowe ballroom, 40 in the chandeliers, 60 on the walls, 40 in the lamps. I asked the steward. He looked at her then. You count them. Every ball, every year your maid told mine, and mine told me, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. A woman who counts candles is a woman who has built a whole world in a place where no one built one for her. I am not offering you a rescue, Miss Ellery. You do not need one, and we both know it. I am offering you a house where the candles are yours to light or not light. A library you have not already read, and a man who has been looked at his whole life, and would like, for the rest of it, to be seen instead. You see me. You have since the bookshop. I have decided I cannot do without it. He drew a breath. That is the true answer. It is not romantic. I am not a romantic man. But it is the whole of what I have. And it is yours, if you want it. The library was very quiet between his words. She could hear the small tick of the candle burning and the rain, and once, far off, a door opening and closing on a burst of music, and then the hush again. She became aware, with the slowness of a thing that has been true for a long time before it is admitted, that she was not afraid of him. She had been afraid, in one way or another, of nearly every room she had ever stood in. This room with this man in this hour, she was not afraid of. The candle flame stood between them, small and straight, and neither of them reached to adjust it. It burned the way a thing burns when there is no draught left in the house to trouble it. Maren stood very still. The rain came harder, drumming softly, and somewhere down the hall the music ended, and a wave of applause rose and faded. She thought of her aunt's voice, soft as fur. You are too plain to be chosen. She thought of 7 years of pillars. She thought of a hand held out, palm up, waiting, not grabbing. And she thought of a boy in a kitchen passage, and a man on his knees picking up broken glass when no one was looking, telling no one, wanting nothing. She held out her hand. He looked at it, and then at her face, and something came into his own face that she had seen only once before, in a bookshop, when a duke had said thank you and meant it. He took her hand in both of his, warm, big-knuckled, scarred, and held it, not raising it to his lips, not claiming it, simply holding it, the way you hold something you have been waiting a long time to be trusted with. Yes, Maren said. One word. The smallest word in the language, and the room, the rain, the whole of London, stood still to make room for it. He did not kiss her. There would be time enough, A lifetime of time for that. He opened the library door for her, and the light and noise of the ball came in, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they went back to tell the world what the world already knew. They married in June, in a church full of people who had laughed at her in May, and if that gave her any pleasure, she was too well-bred to show it. Lady Odella Vane sent a silver epergne, and was seated, by the Duchess's own direction, at the far end of the church behind a pillar. Sabina married a baronet the following spring, and was heard to say, for the rest of her life, that she had always been her cousin's dearest friend. Maren bore it all with the patience of a woman who had waited 7 years for her life, and did not intend to waste any of it on settling scores. The scores, as it turned out, settled themselves. A year later, on a wet evening in November, the Duke and Duchess of Rathmore sat in the library of the house in Grosvenor Square, which was no longer the cold back room it had been in his bachelor days, but the warm heart of the house, with 2 fires burning, and books piled on every table, and a great ugly dog the Duchess had rescued from a carriage accident asleep between them, snoring. The Duke had letters to write. The Duchess had a novel. The rain came down against the windows, and the fires cracked and sighed, and the room smelled of wood smoke, and lavender, and the wet wool of the dog. A branch of candles on the Duchess's table had been burning badly all evening. The tallow was poor, from a new chandler, and one flame kept guttering and dying down and struggling up again, making the shadows jump. The Duke looked up from his letters at the sound of it, the small spitting fuss of a dying candle, and he watched it for a moment, and then he looked at his wife. She was deep in her book, curled sideways in her chair in a way no duchess in a painting would ever sit, one foot tucked under her, the firelight on her plain, serious, beloved face, turning a page. The candle sputtered. The shadows jumped. She did not look up. She did not count them. She had not counted a candle in a year. He had watched her at their first ball after the wedding, watched her stand in the middle of the floor she had once stood beside, and not once in the whole evening, had her eyes gone to the chandeliers to number the lights. The locked room she had lived in for 7 years stood open now, its books read by 2, its pages turned by 4 hands. She did not need to count anything anymore. There was nothing to defend, nothing to endure, nothing to be got through. There was only an evening, and a fire, and a book, and a man watching her with the candlelight in his eyes. The Duke of Rathmore looked at his wife for a long moment, and then he got up and trimmed the candle himself, because the servants had gone to bed, and he had never in his life asked anyone to do for him what his own 2 hands could do. The flame stood up straight and clear. He sat back down and took up his pen. The dog sighed in its sleep. The rain went on. She never counted candles again. That is the whole of this story, in the end. They called her too plain to be chosen, and a man crossed a room and asked for her hand first, before the beauties, before the fortunes, before anyone. But the choosing was never the point. The point was this. For the first time in her life, when Maren looked up, someone was already looking back.